Have you ever watched a scene in a film that stays with you for years? For me, this happened with this movie. And what's funny is I don't like the whole film. It's just this one scene. And I find myself thinking about it a lot these days. In order to tell you what I mean, first I have to tell you about the first time I discovered this film. This was back in 2018. I was sitting in a bar in Beirut with some friends. Projected onto one of the walls of this bar was a film played without sound. I didn't pay much attention to it, it just looked like some whatever film. Until I became aware of a brooding figure standing completely still. I found myself growing increasingly curious. And then he spoke.
لكن الحقيقة لها وجهان. لقد استمعنا إلى الرواية الإغريقية وسمعنا أحيانا صوت الضحية الطروادية على لسان يوريبيدس. أما أنا فإنني أبحث عن شاعر طروادة لأن طروادة لم تروي حكايتها.
I was honestly kind of shocked, because this isn't just some character in some whatever film. This is Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet. I remember so well I turned to my friends and I told this to them, but they were absorbed in some other conversation. So I remember turning back to the film and focusing on it and trying to absorb everything he was about to say.
وأتساءل هل الشعب أو البلد الذي له شعراء كبار يملك الحق في السيطرة على شعب آخر لا شعراء له؟ وهل غياب الشعر عند شعب يشكل سببا كافيا لهزيمته؟ هل الشعر إيماء أم هو أحد أدوات السلطة؟ هل بإمكان شعب أن يكون قويا دون أن يكتب شعرا؟
If I'm honest, at the time I had no idea what he was talking about. But I had this great impression that he was saying something profound. Something that I couldn't even make sense of at the moment. And before I could make any attempts at it, he continued.
أنا ابن شعب غير معترف به بما فيه الكفاية حتى الآن. أريد أن أتكلم باسم الغائب، باسم شاعر طروادة. فإن الوحي الشعري والمشاعر الإنسانية قد تظهر أكبر في الهزيمة مما هي في النصر.
I rushed back home that night and frantically searched for the film. It didn't take me long. Notre, Musique, Jean-Luc Goddard, 2004. I found the film online, I watched it, discovered that I didn't actually like the film, but I rewatched the clip several times, and transcribed Mahmoud Darwish's words. And then I basically spent the next few years thinking about what it all means. Although I never fully stopped thinking about this film and that scene and its implications, the last 10 months of barbaric violence by the State of Israel in the form of genocide, aggression, and settler colonialism has definitely made thinking about stories and poetry and narratives feel a little unnecessary, or at least not the most pressing thing. But I was recently reminded of the centrality of storytelling and of stories in the Palestinian struggle for liberation when I watched this TED Talk from 2014.
Stories are also important in our lives as Palestinians, as people under occupation, as native peoples on this land, not only because they make us, they shape us, they make us the people we are, but also because they connect us with our past. They connect us with our present, and they prepare us to the future.
For those that don't know who that was the martyr poet, Refaat, who was assassinated by the Israelis on December the 6th, 2023. He's possibly best known for writing the poem, If I Must Die, which has become an anthem of sorts. His words, and indeed his whole story, really reminds me of what Darwish was talking about when he was talking about Trojan poets. I think the story and the poetry that both men were talking about can both be understood literally and metaphorically. That is, I think they're both actual stories that Palestinians tell, but also the story of Palestine as a whole. It has become painfully clear that the state of Israel, its government, its institutions, and a substantial, significant portion of its population don't consider Palestinians to be human. And in many ways, the Western states, institutions, media organizations, and also large parts of their societies as well, don't either. And so, if you don't think these people have a right to live, then you also don't believe that they have a right to narrate their lives. It is important to note that most formerly colonized societies have already for decades stood in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation. I'll pull up just one example of this here, which is a General Assembly resolution from 1974, and you can see the splits pretty clear. But only more recently is there a new welcoming development, which is that there is more discussions and mobilizations and actions in the global north, in the metropole, the imperial centers, in support of Palestinian liberation and struggles against occupation, and now against genocide. But that shift has yet to reach spaces with institutional power or influence. But I do think stories and narratives do still play a huge role. This is what I think Darwish was referring to when he talked about poetry as an instrument of power. I think the story of Zionism has always appealed more to the powerful, to the industrialized imperialist West, much more so than the Palestinian story, the indigenous, native story. In many ways, that colonial story is the European story. Europe created and nurtured that story long before the Zionist movement even began to form. It's a story that I think Europe and its extensions have never really disentangled themselves from, both ideologically and materially. And I think that hideous face, that barbaric violence of that era, is really showing its face once again. But like all colonized people, Palestinians have always offered their resistance, in many ways, including armed struggle, but also through telling and retelling their stories. And maybe for the first time, in part because of social media, many people, and here I mean in the global north, are understanding Palestine from the mouth of the Palestinian. There is with that a need to re-examine and revisit the hegemonic narratives on Zionism, on Palestine, because those narratives still exist, and they still hold tremendous institutional weight. And at the same time, the counter-hegemonic narratives don't have that same institutional backing. Edward Said, the Palestinian scholar and theorist, put it very well in this interview with a very young Salman Rushdie.
There seems to be nothing sort of in the world that sustains the story, that keeps it there. In other words, unless you're telling it, it's just going to drop and disappear. Sort of, so like Scheherazade in a funny
So it needs to be perpetually told,
in order to exist. Yeah, exactly. In order to be, whereas you feel that the other narratives are there and they're kind of permanent and they're, you know, they have a kind of institutional existence, and you have to just try and work away at them.
Seen in this way, stories can have a subversive aspect to them. They can be counter-hegemonic, and in some ways they can be a site of resistance in and of themselves.
Now, Edward Said warns of this. If we stop caring about stories, if we stop telling our stories, if we stop listening to our parents, we create space, we create vacuum for others to occupy this virtual space in our past, in our heart.
I wanted to play at least a couple of clips from that TED Talk because I think Refaat's story is such an embodiment of what he was saying. The Israelis want to kill the story. And in order to try to do that, they kill the storyteller. But as Palestinians have shown, they can never kill the story. They have done this for decades. And indeed, every genocidal regime has done this. Because if you want to kill a people, you have to kill the story of those people. And that's why every genocide has always included the mass killing of writers, academics, scholars, and poets. Palestinians know this has always been an aspect of Zionism, and that's why Palestinian elders always indicate that
شو بتحب تقول يا حاج للجيل الطالع الفلسطيني؟
بحب أقول له بعد جيل أو 100 جيل بعد 100 جيل يعني أنا بموت وغيري بيموت ما ينسى فلسطين أماني برقبتهم.
telling and retelling their stories is a task that every Palestinian, indeed every colonized person, holds incredibly close. But I think it would be a mistake to simply typecast the colonized, or the subaltern, if you will. In other words, I don't think it's enough to understand their situation, even if understanding it from them themselves, but rather I think we should all constantly attempt to understand the structures and histories we all live under from their perspectives as well. That is, not simply to understand the colonies from the colonized, but also to understand the center or the metropole from them as well. I think this is basically just a shorthand description of what post-colonialism is. The American writer Toni Morrison sums this up very concisely as well.
I stood at the border, stood at the edge, and claimed it as central, and let the rest of the world move over to where I was.
Or put even more concisely,
Moi, l'Europe n'est pas mon centre. L'Europe est une périphérie de l'Afrique.
Here are two notes on the terms that I'll be using before I start the video proper. For the first part, I will be talking a lot about victimized and marginalized and oppressed people. By this, I definitely do not mean victims are static people who lack any agency. The complete opposite. I think people who are victimized under certain structures of domination actually hold an incredible amount of knowledge and awareness of those structures. And that awareness, I think, is something that all of us can benefit from. As Bell Hooks says in this essay entitled Marginality as a Site of Resistance. Marginality is also the site of radical possibility, a space of resistance. It was this marginality that I was naming as a central location for the production of a counter-hegemonic discourse that is not just found in words, but in habits of being and the ways one lives. It offers the possibility of radical perspectives from which to see and create, to imagine alternatives, new worlds. And secondly, I will be talking a lot about Zionism. And by Zionism, I don't mean a historical movement way back when. No. Zionism is what's happening today. It is what is still unfolding to this present moment. It is also the framework that connects the genocide in Gaza with the settler colonial campaign in the West Bank, with the Israeli aggression on Lebanon, and with the attachment to Western imperialist interests and why Western states are so heavily backing this rogue colonial regime. And I really think that you cannot understand the current genocide in Gaza without first understanding the Nakba of 1948. And you can't really understand the Nakba without understanding Zionism. And I hate to add a third one, but I don't think you can fully understand Zionism without understanding colonialism. So what I'm going to do in this video is not present two equal narratives, because in no way are they equal. Rather, I am going to try to present, in part, the counter-hegemonic narratives of Zionism that are produced in its margins by its victims and its resistors. Even with everything going on today, the task of telling and retelling this history and these narratives from the Palestinian standpoint is something that Palestinians are still taking on, even amidst genocide.
إلى كل متابعين القصص والحكايات في كل بقاع الأرض، معكم حكواتية، ومعنا حكاية جديدة بعنوان غزة والاستعمار.
I found it incredibly powerful that after 6 months of surviving and documenting genocide, herself now displaced in a tent in Rafah, that Bisan would return to her original passion, storytelling. I also found it equally telling that the story she decided to tell, in the moment that she had the briefest space away from the urgency of her current situation, was the story of Gaza, its history, and its encounters and resistance against numerous occupying forces. Again, what's more is hearing her recount this history is incredible, because she cuts through so much propaganda. It reminds me of this little clip from Rashid Khalidi, the Palestinian academic and writer.
Older people inside Palestine, in the refugee camps, and in the larger diaspora, Palestinian diaspora, talk of the British or the Israelis or the Americans in almost the same breath, as if they're different faces of the same foe. In other words, they see things more clearly than a lot of scholars.
I don't know why he emphasizes older people, because as we'll see with Bisan, the same understanding exists. So after going through the long history and heritage of Gaza, Bisan enters the modern era, with the end of the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire.
أجت بريطانيا وأخذت أو انتدبت فلسطين، ولكن هذا الانتداب اسمه استعمار علشان سببين رئيسيين. السبب الأول إنه حسب عصبة الأمم المتحدة هذه اللي حطت الانتداب، الدولة المنتدبة من حقها تختار الانتداب، وإحنا ما اخترنا بريطانيا. والسبب الثاني إنه الانتداب بيجي علشان يساعد أهل الأرض في إنهم يستقروا، ولكن بريطانيا شو عملت؟ الفرصة اللي كانت تستناها الدول الاستعمارية.
See what I mean? I come from Lebanon, and the amount of times that I've heard that the mandates weren't colonialism, that they were just trying to help us and get us ready for democracy, complete bullshit. It was colonialism pure and simple. It was backed by incredible amounts of force, it was heavily opposed by local populations, and it was just colonialism. In 2002, the Indian writer Arundhati Roy gave a speech entitled Come September, where she recounts this history as well.
On the 11th of September 1922, ignoring Arab outrage, the British government proclaimed a mandate in Palestine, a follow-up to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which Imperial Britain issued with its army massed outside the gates of Gaza. The Balfour Declaration promised European Zionists a national home for Jewish people. At the time, the empire on which the sun never set was free to snatch and bequeath national homes like a school bully distributes marbles.
As for the idea that these mandates had anything to do with helping the local population, here's Alfred Balfour himself, the writer of the Balfour Declaration and the foreign minister of the UK at the time. For in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country, though the American Commission has been going through the form of asking what they are. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long tradition, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. In my opinion, that is right. Not to flood this part with citations, but there's also this from the same speech by Arundhati Roy.
In 1937, Winston Churchill said of the Palestinians, I quote, "I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place."
This is Winston Churchill. This is someone who is still incredibly highly venerated, and it's almost blasphemic to say anything about him in the UK. He has a statue outside of Parliament, his face is on the British pound. This is precisely what I mean when I say that Europe has never gotten over, moved past, or been held accountable for its long legacy of colonialism and the fascism that it breeds. So this is the setting of the scene. And with the British control of Palestine, they begin to assist the European Zionists in building a national homeland for all the world's Jewish people in Palestine. But why?
هاي دولة حق لليهود أيا كانت جنسيتهم هو لإقامة مصلحة أو الحفاظ على المصالح الغربية في الشرق. دولة موالية للغرب ولكنها موجودة بالشرق، سواء في حرب عالمية أو ما في حرب عالمية. هاي الدولة رح تعمل على سرقة الثروات، سرقة الأرض، اقتلاع الشعب، الحفاظ على المصالح الغربية.
If anyone thinks that this sounds like conspiracy thinking, this is precisely how Theodor Herzl, the founder of the modern Zionist movement, envisioned the Jewish state. In his manifesto in 1896, he wrote this: "If His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism." By the way, that wasn't real footage. It was from this ridiculous 1921 biopic about the man, which also includes this image. Yikes. Like they say, 1,000 words. But yes, this isn't just anybody. I haven't selected some random preacher with kooky ideas. This guy's ideas and planning and organizing was foundational to the early formations of the Zionist movement. He is also someone who is still held incredibly close in the state of Israel. They literally have a mountain named after him, where they bury their notables, politicians, soldiers, whatever. This guy is foundational, and in many ways, what he set out to do is what is still taking place. And in his writings, you notice that he doesn't so much as mention the Palestinians, the native population of the land that he was planning on colonizing. And although that sounds a bit strange, it's actually kind of canonical for colonial thinking. The natives don't matter, and they only matter insofar as they're a nuisance that needs to be mitigated. To that end, Herzl does write this in his diaries: "Both the expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." Zionism is, and always has been, a colonial project, and with that comes a complete dehumanization and contempt for the native, who literally does not deserve the land that they stand on.
كيف ممكن حدا مستعمر ما بيرجع لهاي الأرض ولا جدوده من هان يجي يسلب الأرض من فلاح فلسطيني عربي كنعاني الأصل، من شخص مسلم مسيحي أو يهودي موجود في فلسطين.
It feels almost like she's asking very similar questions to the ones that Darwish was asking. Or rather, I think she's asking questions that Darwish was answering with his questions. That sounds a bit confusing. To explain what I mean, let's take a look at this very early Zionist propaganda film from 1935 entitled The Land of Promise. The film depicts Palestine from the perspective of the Zionist colonizer, and essentially can be read as a visual text declaring and depicting the righteousness of the Zionist project. It starts with scenes of uncivilized natives, primitive, backwards. The local population have let the land decay. It is wasted on them. Then we see scenes of Jewish settlers, modern, productive, civilized. With shots taken straight from Soviet-era cinema, the juxtaposition is clear.
And with the most modern machinery, the Jews are bringing back to Palestine its long neglected fruitfulness.
The film ends with this charter, calling for funding for immigration and colonization. The thesis of the film is as follows: we deserve the land because we can make better use of it. This logic is as old as colonialism itself. As Edward Said notes in an essay whose title I have shamelessly taken for this video, for an uncivilized people, land was either farmed badly, i.e., inefficiently by Western standards, or it was left to rot. A civilized man, it was believed, could cultivate the land because it meant something to him. On it, accordingly, he bred useful arts and crafts. He created, he accomplished, he built. From this string of ideas, by which whole native societies who lived on American, African, and Asian territories for centuries were suddenly denied their right to live on that land, came the great dispossessing movements of modern European colonialism. Land in Asia, Africa, and the Americas was there for European exploitation, because Europe understood the value of land in a way impossible for the natives. In this specific case, the Zionist claims of making the desert bloom can be dismissed by listening to Palestinians who were there before they were expelled.
الزرع ومعنة الله معنة الله إنه ما بكيت تعرف تمشي فيه هيك الزرع الخضرة تصير فيها تطلع الصبح تروحي على المكساء تهدى ريحة الخضرة تفحفح نوار على الخيار نوار على الفقوس هالبندورة ها الحبة.
Oral history is, of course, crucial in understanding this history, in providing counter-hegemonic narratives, but also to recenter the exact same voices who have been so heavily marginalized and dispossessed by Zionism. But what's also hidden within these narratives is the tremendous amounts of violence that's needed to uphold one and erase the other. During the 1948 war, during the Nakba in specific, Zionist forces not only expelled upwards of 800,000 Palestinians from Palestine, they also destroyed hundreds of villages, razed them, and planted over them to remove their traces. They destroyed libraries, archives, any trace of Palestinian existence on that land. Moshe Dayan, a Zionist militant and defense minister of the State of Israel, said this in 1969. "We came to this country, which was already populated by Arabs, and we are establishing a Hebrew, that is, a Jewish, state here. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of these Arab villages, and I don't blame you, because the geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. There is not one place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population." No longer exist is a euphemism for we destroyed them. And try as they might, the Israelis have never been able to kill the story. One fascinating and depressing example of this is the Palestine Research Center in Beirut. It was founded in 1965, just 1 year after the PLO was founded. The Palestine Research Center was a place where knowledge was created, where texts and films were archived. They had, at the height, about 25,000 different volumes in their archives. They also published a bi-monthly magazine on Palestine and Palestinian affairs. They also published dozens of books, and I actually have an example of one right here. This is the first book they published, by Faiz Sawyagh, called Zionist Colonialism in Palestine. The building that the PRC was in had a printing press, an archive, and was a space to understand and learn and disseminate knowledge on Palestine, on Zionism, on European colonialism and American imperialism, and just so much more. I said this was a depressing story because, well, in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon and invaded and besieged Beirut. The building that housed the Palestine Research Center was bombed and looted by the Israelis and by their fascist Christian militia collaborators in Beirut. The archives were looted, and many of the possessions are now to be found in an archive unit in Tel Aviv. That experiment was cut short, and is yet again another example of how the Zionists try to kill the story by killing the storyteller, by literally bombing the printing press. But obviously things have changed since then. In 1979, Edward Said lamented that there is an almost total absence of any handily available historical knowledge from non-Zionist sources. But I don't think that is the case anymore. With books like The 100-Year War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi, or The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ian Pape, as well as countless essays on Palestine and on Zionism by non-Zionist sources, there is definitely now, more than ever, an abundance of academic literature and scholarship on the topic. But much more important, I think, is in the music, the poetry, and the films, which Palestinians have turned to, especially since the First Intifada. One of the most interesting examples of this new Palestinian cinema is Elia Leman's 2009 film, The Time That Remains. After a prologue depicting the 1948 Nakba, the film has 3 parts, showing 3 stages of Elia Leman's life. In the 70s, after the defeat of Arab nationalism in 1967, in the 80s, leading up to the First Intifada, and in the mid-2000s, when the film was shot. Although the whole film is illuminating in its visual metaphors, the prologue is the part that stands out the most to me. Not only through its depictions of the lives and stories that were ruptured by the violence and expulsions of the 1948 Nakba, but also with its depiction of Zionist brutality and criminality. This scene in specific. Although fiction, this scene captures a truth that subverts the official narratives that the State of Israel maintains to this day, that the mass expulsions of 48 of the Nakba happened as a result of a chaos of war, that Arab leaders told people to flee, that the 1948 war was won for survival. All lies. I recognize, of course, that I have yet to speak of why Zionism came about to begin with, why Jews in Europe felt the need to flee, why they indeed were already fleeing even before Zionism was invented. That is the deep, brutal, and genocidal white supremacy in the form of anti-Semitism that spurred on this movement to begin with. Indeed, if you were to read Theodor Herzl's manifesto, you get a sense of 2 distinct parts. The first part outlines in great detail the real persecution of Jews by white Europeans, and then the second part, a plan to colonize another land in order to seek safety over there, which feels like a morbid non sequitur. And it's that same morbid non sequitur that is so apparent whenever this discourse comes about. Whenever you hear people from the US or the UK or Germany defend their decision to send more weapons to the State of Israel in this moment of genocide. And here again, Edward Said's words are incredibly helpful. To those Palestinian victims that Zionism displaced, it cannot have meant anything by way of sufficient cause that Jews were victims of European anti-Semitism, and given Israel's continued oppression of Palestinians, few Palestinians are able to see beyond their reality, namely that Occidental Jews in Israel, once victims themselves, have become oppressors of Palestinian Arabs and Oriental Jews. I've been borrowing quite a bit from Edward Said in this video, and specifically that one essay, not because there aren't any other essays on the topic. I do so for 2 reasons. One is because it's a foundational essay. It still really holds up. And I think it may be one of the first examples of an essay doing what it suggests in the title, giving an account of Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, specifically in the English-speaking Western world. But also it's kind of haunting, because when you read it, it's scary how many of the discourses that he names that we are still having and still encountering to this day. For instance, his need to respond preemptively to accusations of anti-Semitism, or his insistence that the Nakba did happen, set against a hegemonic narrative of essentially Nakba denialism, and that the refugees that it created still exist and, in violation of international law, are not allowed to return. Or the fact that his need to argue that Zionism is a European colonial movement. And mostly, one of the most important things he names in this essay, incredibly very early on, is that Zionism is the main obstacle, is the main force that is preventing anything that resembles peace or a resolution to the so-called conflict. Another reason that I'm using Edward Said a lot in this essay is because he really has a unique positionality to connect Palestine to the larger and longer history of European colonialism and imperialism. I think those connections are really important, especially in a time when we see colonial violence everywhere, or situations that are a result of colonialism, and in which our movements in response need to also be anti-colonial in a very real sense, that connects all of these struggles and understands the roots of not just the situation in Palestine, but also in the Congo, and in Sudan, and across the entire global south. But here I have to admit something. I didn't play the full clip of Mahmoud Darwish in the film Notre, Musique. There is one last bit of it that I hesitate to play because I know that it can be very, very cynically misinterpreted. But I think it's incredibly powerful, and I think even more enigmatic than the other clips that I played.
هل تعلمين لماذا نحن الفلسطينيين مشهورون؟ لأنكم أنتم أعداؤنا. إن الاهتمام بنا نابع من الاهتمام بالمسألة اليهودية. نعم، الاهتمام بك وليس بي أنا. إذن نحن قليلو الحظ في أن تكون إسرائيل هي عدونا، لأنها تحظى بمؤيدين لا حد لهم في العالم، ونحن أيضا محظوظون لأن تكون إسرائيل عدونا، لأن اليهود هم مركز اهتمام العالم. لذلك ألحقتم بنا الهزيمة وأعطيتمونا الشهرة. لقد ألحقتم بنا الهزيمة ولكن منحتمونا الشهرة.
There are so many ways to interpret that, I think. I don't think he's talking about the average person who is mobilizing or organizing to stop this current genocide, or indeed for a longer history to stop the colonial project of Zionism. Some read into it the idea of white guilt, the idea that states like Germany are so heavily defending the state of Israel, even in this moment of genocide, out of a sense of historical duty, of almost like reparations for their vile, white supremacist, genocidal anti-Semitism. Early Zionist thinkers, such as Herzl, did describe Zionism as an antidote to European anti-Semitism. Interestingly enough, here's a quote from Alfred Balfour, who, although an avid Zionist, is also a raging anti-Semite himself. The Zionist movement would mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or to absorb. Here I think we see why the idea of the Jewish problem is incredibly racist and confused. What I think it's describing is the white supremacist problem. European states in particular seek redemption from the State of Israel without having to do their own soul-searching or dismantling of their white supremacy. I think a large reason why fascism is in ascendance in the US and in Europe is because there has never really been a reckoning with colonialism. And in many ways, colonialism never really ended. Not just through these barbaric examples like the State of Israel, or the smaller island nations that France and Spain and the UK still possess, but also through neo-colonial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. But that's probably a different video essay. Here, I think post-colonial writers have a lot to say. For instance, this quote by American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois. "There was no Nazi atrocity, concentration camps, wholesale maiming and murder, defilement of women, or ghastly blasphemy of childhood, which Christian civilization, or Europe, had not long been practicing against colored folk in all parts of the world, in the name of, and for the defense of, a superior race born to rule the world." In many ways, fascism in Europe is colonialism brought home, and there has never been any accountability for colonialism. This long history is not something that just happened over there. It has formed and reformed the European identity in terrifying ways. As Aimé Césaire notes, "Colonization, I repeat, dehumanizes even the most civilized man. That colonial activity, colonial enterprise, colonial conquest, which is based on contempt for the native and justified by that contempt, inevitably tends to change him who undertakes it. That the colonizer who, in order to ease his conscience, gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal." When Fanon wrote in 1961 that there is yet to be a single French soldier indicted in front of a French court of justice for the murder of an Algerian man, he really was predicting. The same could be said of any colonial regime, not least of all the State of Israel. And what's more is what we're seeing being live streamed before our very eyes is the bedrock of European colonial history, for which no European or American figure has ever stood trial for. We live in a time of multiple ongoing genocides, of economic, political, and climate collapse. All these struggles and collapses have their roots in colonialism. The current realities feel so dictated by bombs, by guns, by police batons, and by intimidation. But I have to believe that there is still something in identifying the source of oppression, and not only in a way that illuminates the struggles against the oppressor, but also in a way that implicates and makes clear that we are all implicated. I think that is so crucial in building an actual internationalist left that I think is so needed to tackle some of these structures and dismantle some of these systems that are literally making this world uninhabitable. And so in this case in specific, it needs be said that genocide is not only permissible under Zionism, but is a core facet of it. In order for this genocide to end, in order for anything resembling progress or development within this so-called conflict, Zionism as a racist, supremacist, exclusionary structure and ideology needs to be dismantled. I say this as a person who comes from a country who has for decades faced the violence and brutality of this structure, of this colonial project, as well as constantly resisted against it. But I also say this as a person with a soul, as a citizen of the world, who is so constantly pained by the daily massacres, by the injustice and the suffering that we are seeing live streamed every single day. What's happening in Gaza affects all of us, and it has totally altered the world we live in. And I don't know how to end this, but for some reason I also feel like I shouldn't be the one to do it. So instead, here's a last clip from Bisan's video.
هاي الحرب أقوى من أي حرب، وكل مرة كان أهل غزة بطريقة ما بتعرفوهاش كيف كانوا قادرين على النهوض والنجاة، ولكن هاي المرة غير. وهاي المرة نهاية غزة هي لا محالة نهاية العالم، لأن واضح إنه العالم كل ما بتطور آلياته للقتل، بيتطور جشعه واستباحته للأبرياء. غزة لو ما نجت هاي المرة معناته إنه البقاء للأعنف والأكثر وحشية. كنت معكم حكواتية.
This video was created with the support of From the Periphery, a new media collective building internationalist dialogues and connecting struggles from across the world. If you want to support our work, consider heading over to our Patreon. By becoming a member, you not only help create more videos like this, but also help support all the other projects within the collective, including the podcast, The Fire These Times, as well as my own podcast, Politically Depressed. You also get access to exclusive content made just for you. Thanks for listening.